Hello, my name is Teach, and this will be part 3 of Understanding the World of Ice and Fire. The coming continues. If you remember, in part 1 I explained to you that the world of Ice and Fire is written from the perspective of Maester Yandel of the Citadel, and I told you that the Maesters aren't exactly to be trusted. I also explained a theory I'm going to apply about the word mayhaps. If George uses mayhaps, I believe he's trying to deceive us. But if he uses the word perhaps, I believe there is some truth involved. If you haven't seen part 1, I'll link it up top now. Part 1 was all about the Dawn Age. Part 2, if you haven't seen it, it will be linked up above now, was the beginning of the coming of the First Men, where we got into the beginning of the chapter of the First Men, and then we talked about Dorne, the Stormlands, the Westerlands, and the Riverlands. Once we got done talking about the Riverlands, we talked about war and how awful men are during war. And I proposed a theory to you that the first men made it to the God's Eye and out to the Isle of Faces, where they found an old god. And what does Brunn say that we need after a battle?
First, you need a woman. Nothing like a woman after a fight.
So what do you think the first men would do if after a battle they found a beautiful goddess? I imagine they would have their way with her, and this violation caused her to scream out in anguish, and it cracks one of the 2 moons in the sky, and black stone rains all over the world. But luckily there was one man who stood up, and he became the last hero, and he takes Nissa and he flees north, where she gives birth to her only son, Azor Ahai. But she screams again, and a little piece of the other moon breaks, and it falls far to the north in Westeros. I also have my own theory where they follow that falling star. And Azor Ahai learns to talk to the trees, he learns to warg animals, and up at the Fist of the First Men, by the Milkwater, they find a white stone. And when he touches the white stone, he's able to transfigure it into milk glass daggers and a sword that will one day become Dawn. And then Nissa enchants one of the daggers to summon all the darkness and ash that has filled the world. But the dagger is not powerful enough to hold it all on its own. And the last hero has to take up the dagger, and he shoves it in the Nissa's chest. And now she is holding all the darkness inside of her, making her made of light. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We have a few more chapters in the coming of the First Men, so let's finish those now. So now that we got to the event that I think caused the breaking, let's go back to Dorne and finish off that section.
The breaking, the single most important event in Dornish history, and mayhaps the history of all Westeros, is one about which, to our frustration, we know far too little.
George says mayhaps, so the breaking is not the most important thing to happen in Westeros. My guess is that the most important thing to happen was the pact.
The first men overwhelmed the elder race wherever they met, for the weapons of the children were made of bone and wood and dragonglass. Finally, driven by desperation, the little people turned to sorcery and beseeched their green seers to stem the tide of these invaders.
This is just a quick reminder of where we left off in this chapter.
Gathering in their hundreds, some say on the Isle of Faces, and calling on their old gods with song and prayer and grisly sacrifice. 1,000 captured men were fed to the weirwood, one version of the tale goes, whilst another claims the children use the blood of their own young.
Blood sacrifice is always so important in Game of Thrones, but ultimately, I think they got it wrong. It was Nissa's maiden's blood.
And the old gods stirred, and giants awoke in the earth, and all of Westeros shook and trembled. Great cracks appeared in the earth, and hills and mountains collapsed and were swallowed up. And then the seas came rushing in, and the arm of Dorne was broken and shattered by the force of the water, until only a few bare, rocky islands remained above the waves. The Summer Sea joined the Narrow Sea, and the bridge between Essos and Westeros vanished for all time.
This violation caused Nissa to stir, and her scream was so loud it woke giants in the earth. This might be where giants actually came from. All of Westeros shook and trembled, and hills and mountains collapsed and were swallowed up. Her scream was so powerful that it shattered the fiery moon, and it rained all over the world, with a very large chunk landing in Ashai by the shadow. And this caused the seas to come rushing in, and the arm of Dorne was broken and shattered by the force of the waters.
Or so the legend says. Most scholars do agree that Essos and Westeros were once joined. Today the seas divide them, so plainly some version of the event the Dornish call the breaking must have occurred. Was it the work of the children of the forest and the sorcery of their green seers? These things are less certain. Archmaester Cassander suggests that it was not the singing of green seers that parted Westeros from Essos, but rather what he calls the song of the sea, a slow rising of the waters that took place over centuries, not in a single day.
Well, I gotta give it to Archmaester Cassander. He was right. It wasn't the singing of the green singers. but I definitely wouldn't say it was a slow rising of the waters.
Even if we accept that the old gods broke the arm of Dorne with the hammer of the waters, as the legends claim, the Green Seers sang their song too late. So many of their forebears had already made the crossing that they outnumbered the dwindling elder races almost 3-1 by the time the lands were severed. And that disparity only grew in the centuries that followed.
This is the only time in the book that they refer to the hammer of the waters, which makes sense because a meteor striking the ocean, that's definitely hammering the water. The fact that they point out the singers sang their song too late because the men already outnumbered the elder races 3-1 should be a big hint that something else actually happened. So with that, let's move on to the next section.
Just as we speak of the 100 kingdoms of yore, though there was never a time when Westeros was actually divided into 100 independent states.
I'm adding this section about the 100 kingdoms of yore because during this time, Westeros was probably broken down into many kingdoms, probably close to 100 or even more. The Maesters are just voicing their opinions again. Ultimately, the number 100 is going to be a symbolic identifier for us later on.
Barrington, too, is somewhat of a curiosity, a gathering place built at the foot of the reputed barrow of the first king, who once ruled supreme over all the first men, the Dustins, loyal bannermen to the Starks, who have ruled the Barrowlands in their name since the fall of the last of the Barrow kings.
The rusted crown upon the arms of House Dustin derives from their claim that they are themselves descended from the first king and the Barrow kings who ruled after him.
The Dustins are descendant of the first king, who led the first men across the arm of Dorne into Westeros.
The old tales recorded in Kennett's Passages of the Dead claim that a curse was placed on the Great Barrow that would allow no living man to rival the first king. This curse made these pretenders to the title grow corpse-like in their appearance as it sucked away their vitality and life.
A curse that made people grow corpse-like and sucked away their vitality? I bet I could find a few characters that fit that description within this world.
The men of the North are descendants of the first men, their blood only slowly mingling with that of the Andals, who overwhelmed the kingdoms to the south. Other aspects of their culture have faded away, such as the grislier aspects of their worship, when criminals and traitors were killed and their bodies and entrails hung from the branches of weirwoods.
Or blood sacrifice. How do you open the eyes of a weirwood tree? Is carving a face into it enough? Or does it perhaps take blood sacrifice?
One notable custom that the Northmen hold dearer than any other is guest right, the tradition of hospitality by which a man may offer no harm to a guest beneath his roof, nor a guest to his host.
So what's the deal with guest right? Where did this originate from? And you really have to understand the wording here. Guest right is the tradition of hospitality in which a man may offer no harm to a guest beneath his roof, nor can that guest do harm to his host. Where did this come from? What happened to make this so important to the first men?
In the north, they tell the tale of the Rat Cook, who served an Andal king, identified by some as King Tywell II of the Rock, and by others as King Oswald I of the Vale and Mountain, the flesh of the king's own son baked into a pie.
The king that the Rat Cook served was either a Lannister of Casterly Rock or an Arryn of the Vale.
He was punished by being turned into a monstrous rat that ate its own young. Yet, the punishment was incurred not for killing the king's son, or for feeding him to the king, but for the breaking of guest right.
The gods weren't mad that he killed the king's son and fed him to the king. They were mad that the king was promised guest right and this guy broke it. Now I'm starting to think Nissa invited the first men to her island before they violated her. So guest right very well may have been part of the pact. And that's why it's so important to the first men and the men of the north, because they remember. Alright, I have a couple lines from the Vale I want to go over.
The first Sir Artis Arryn supposedly rode upon a huge falcon, possibly a distorted memory of dragon riders seen from afar, Archmaester Periston suggests. Armies of eagles fought at his command. To win the Vale, he flew to the top of the giant's lance and slew the Griffin King. He counted giants and merlings amongst his friends, and wed a woman of the children of the forest, though she died, giving birth to his son.
This seems like an important passage. It talks about someone possibly riding a dragon in the Dawn Age and intermarrying with the children of the forest.
100 other tales are told of him, most of them just as fanciful. If such a hero ever walked the mountains and Vale, far back in the dim mists of the Dawn Age, his name was certainly not Artis Arryn, for the Arryns came from pure Andal stock. Like as not, it was the singers of the Vale who conflated these two figures, attributing the deeds of the legendary Winged Knight to the historic Falcon Knight, perhaps in order to curry favor with the real Artis Arryn's successors.
The singers have seemed to merge the Winged Knight and the Falcon Knight together, but the Winged Knight is from the Dawn Age, while the Falcon Knight didn't come around for many thousands of years. The Winged Knight has 100 tales told about him, and if you remember, I said the number 100 will be a symbolic identifier. So the Winged Knight may have been related to Azor Ahai, or the last hero.
The Iron Islands. Were the first men truly first? Most scholars believe they were. But on the Iron Islands, the priests of the drowned god tell a different tale. According to their faith, the Ironborn are a race apart from the common run of mankind. We did not come to these holy islands from godless lands across the seas. We came from beneath those seas, from the watery halls of the drowned god, who made us in his likeness and gave to us dominion over all the waters of the earth. Even among the Ironborn, there are some who doubt this and acknowledge the more widely accepted view of an ancient descent from the first men.
If you take in consideration my theory, then we possibly have a demigod walking around out there. And there is a legend in the Iron Islands about the Great King who took a mermaid to wife. We'll get more into him once we get to the chapter about the Age of Heroes, though.
Archmaester Hayrig once advanced the interesting notion that the ancestors of the Ironborn came from some unknown land west of the Sunset Sea, citing the legend of the Seastone Chair. The throne of the Greyjoys, carved into the shape of a kraken from an oily black stone, was said to have been found by the first men when they first came to Old Wick. Hayrig argued that the chair was a product of the first inhabitants of the islands.
The Iron Islands is the first place Azor Ahai encounters the black, greasy stone. After meeting with the drowned god, he transfigures the stone into the sea stone chair.
It cannot be denied that they stand apart with customs, beliefs, and ways of governance quite unlike those common elsewhere in the Seven Kingdoms. The thin soil did not support the growth of weirwoods. No giants ever made their homes here, nor did the children of the forest walk what woods there were. The old gods worshipped by these elder races were likewise absent, and though the Andals did reach the islands eventually, their faith never took root here either. For another god had come before the Seven, the drowned god, creator of the seas and father of the Ironborn.
This passage definitely makes it seem like Mother Earth had no part of the Iron Islands. The Iron Islands must have belonged to the realm of the drowned god.
Yet even more than the fishermen, Ironborn esteemed their reavers, wolves of the sea. The men of the Westlands and Riverlands named them in days of yore.
So the days of yore reverts to the Dawn Age, and the Ironborn during this time were known as the Wolves of the Sea, almost like they were a precursor to House Stark.
Many legends have come down to us through the millennia of the Salt Kings and Reavers who made the Sunset Sea their own, men as wild and cruel and fearless as any who have ever lived. Thus we hear of the likes of Torgon the Terrible, Jorl the Whale, Dagon Drum the Necromancer, Hrothgar of Pike and his Kraken summoning horn, and Ragged Ralph of Old Wick.
Wow, that sounds like a great bunch of guys there. One of them's known as the Terrible, another the Whale, another guy's known as the Necromancer, and some dude's got a horn that will summon a Kraken. These guys sound like some top-notch Ironborn.
Most infamous of all was Balin Blackskin, who fought with an axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right. No weapon made of man could harm him, it was said. Swords glanced off and left no mark, and axes shattered against his skin. Did such men ever truly walk the earth? It is hard to know. So much of what we know of these demigods of the dawn comes to us from the peoples they plundered and preyed upon.
Wait, what? This dude fought with an axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right, and no weapon made of man could harm him? Where is this dude's show? Okay, here we go. The last section of the Coming of the First Men, and we're going to learn all about Garth Greenhand.
Garth Greenhand. The story of the Reach begins with Garth Greenhand, the legendary progenitor not only of the Tyrells of Highgarden, but of the Gardener kings before them, and all the other great houses and noble families of the Green Realm as well.
And probably most of Westeros.
1,000 tales are told of Garth in the Reach and beyond. Most are implausible and many contradictory. In some, he is a contemporary of Bran the Builder, Lan the Clever, Durin Godsgrief, and the other colourful figures of the Age of Heroes. In others, he stands as the ancestor of them all. Garth was the High King of the first men, it is written. It was he who led them out of the east and across the land bridge to Westeros. Yet other tales would have us believe that he preceded the arrival of the first men by thousands of years, making him not only the first man in Westeros, but the only man.
Keep in mind, the Northmen say that the first king led the first men into Westeros, not Garth. And I tend to agree with the North, because the North remembers.
Some even say he was a god. There is disagreement even on his name. Garth Greenhand, we call him. But in the oldest tales, he is named Garth Greenhair, or simply Garth the Green. Some stories say he had green hands, green hair, or green skin overall. A few even give him antlers like a stag.
Interesting. I have a theory that Azor Ahai was the first Great Seer. And then in the Reach, we have a legend of a green godlike man who most people in the Reach claim to be descended from.
A few of the very oldest tales of Garth Greenhand present us with a considerably darker deity, one who demanded blood sacrifice from his worshippers to ensure a bountiful harvest. In some stories, the green god dies every autumn when the trees lose their leaves, only to be reborn with the coming of spring. This version of Garth is largely forgotten.
Blood sacrifice seems to be the key for the most powerful magic. Who knows where he might disappear to in the winter? I bet it was somewhere gray.
Many of the more primitive peoples of the earth worship a fertility god or goddess, and Garth Greenhand has much and more in common with his deities. Where he walked, farms and villages and orchards sprouted up behind him. About his shoulders was slung a canvas bag, heavy with seed, which he scattered as he went along. As befits a god, his bag was inexhaustible. Within were seeds for all the world's trees and grains and fruits and flowers.
Garth seems to be some kind of creationist. Wherever he went, civilization sprouted up behind him. His inexhaustible bag can be seen as there is no need for him to use that seed, because he can create it with his magical hands. Or he was dropping seeds from his sack, meaning everyone in the world is related to him. Maybe even both.
For the legends tell us that he could make barren women fruitful with a touch. Even crones, whose moon blood no longer flowed. Maidens ripened in his presence. Mothers brought forth twins or even triplets when he blessed them. Young girls flowered at his smile. Lords and common men alike offered up their virgin daughters to him wherever he went, that their crops might ripen and their trees grow heavy with fruit.
Wow, this guy is starting to sound more and more godlike with every passage.
These legends, though cherished by the small folk, are largely discounted by both the maesters of the citadel and the septons of the faith, who share the view that Garth Greenhand was a man, not a god, a hunter or war chief, most likely, or perhaps a petty king. He might well have been the first lord of the first men to lead his followers across the arm of Dorne, as yet unbroken.
Here we go again. The maesters are discounting magic. They don't believe it was real. But we also get a perhaps here. And I think this perhaps is true that he led the first men across the arm of Dorne, but I believe it was broken already, and he led the first men back to Essos.
God or man, Garth Greenhand fathered many children in this new land. On this all the tales agree. Many of those offspring grew to be heroes, kings, and great lords in their own right, founding mighty houses that endured for thousands of years.
I mean, the Age of Heroes is right around the corner, so I imagine he fathered a lot of heroes.
Even the heroes of other lands and kingdoms are sometimes numbered amongst the offspring of the Green Hand. Brandon the Builder was descended from Garth by way of Brandon of the Bloody Blade, these tales would have us believe. Whilst Lan the Clever was a bastard born to Floris the Fox in some tales, or Rowan Goldtree in others.
I'm going to have to agree with the small folk and say that Garth Greenhand was a godly man. Perhaps he is the evidence Nissa Nissa had a son. And finally, that is going to be it for the coming of the first men. This one went a little longer than I wanted, and I need your guys' help. Let me know in the comments if this was a good length, or if I should try to stay shorter, or if I can go longer. If you haven't done so yet, please like and subscribe, and if you don't know what else to watch, check one of these videos linked at the end. If you want to join the discussion, don't forget to check the description for the link to the Discord. Once again, my name is Teach, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.